When you look at someone with an avoidant attachment style, you have to understand something fundamental before anything else makes sense. Their entire emotional system is built around self-protection, not because they don't feel deeply, but because at some point in their development, feeling deeply was associated with danger, rejection, inconsistency, or loss of control. So what they learned was simple: stay composed, stay independent, and never let anyone get too far inside. That's why this first sign is so significant. When an avoidant lets you see their vulnerability, it's not a small moment. It's not casual intimacy. It's a breach in their internal defense system. And that breach doesn't happen because of pressure, persuasion, or logic. It happens because something about you bypasses their usual emotional firewall. Think about how unusual that is for them. Most of the time, avoidants present a version of themselves that is controlled, self-sufficient, and emotionally contained. Even when they're struggling, they will often intellectualize their pain instead of expressing it. They will talk about problems without revealing how those problems actually feel, because feeling exposed means feeling unsafe. So when they start sharing something real, something unfiltered, something that doesn't serve their image of being fine or in control, what's actually happening underneath is a psychological shift. They are beginning to associate your presence with safety rather than threat. And this is where it gets interesting, because vulnerability for an avoidant is not just emotional exposure, it's loss of control. It's allowing another person to see the parts of them they normally keep sealed off, the fears they don't talk about, the disappointments they don't admit, the longing they don't know how to express without feeling dependent. So if they begin to open up to you, even in small ways, it means they are doing something they normally resist at all costs. They are allowing connection to override self-protection. And that only happens when your emotional presence becomes more compelling than their fear of being seen. But here's the deeper layer most people miss. Avoidants don't just fear being hurt, they fear being overwhelmed by emotional dependence. So vulnerability is not just about trust, it's about surrendering control over their own emotional equilibrium. When they let you see what's underneath, they are essentially saying, without words, I'm willing to risk my stability for this connection. That is not attachment out of convenience. That is attachment breaking through resistance. And it rarely happens all at once. It shows up in fragments. A moment of honesty they didn't plan. A confession that slips out in a quiet conversation. A rare admission of fear, regret, or emotional confusion. These are not accidents. These are cracks in a structure that is usually tightly sealed. What makes this even more powerful is that avoidants don't open up easily even when they care. They can care deeply and still remain emotionally distant. So when they finally do let you see something real, it means you are no longer just someone in their life. You are someone their emotional system is starting to trust with what they usually hide from everyone else. And that shift is profound, because once vulnerability enters the relationship, it changes the dynamic permanently. It introduces emotional accountability. It creates depth. It makes detachment harder and connection more real. So when an avoidant lets you see their vulnerability, you're not witnessing weakness, you're witnessing resistance breaking down in real time. You are seeing a person who usually chooses distance begin to choose honesty instead. And that choice is never accidental. It's always meaningful. In the end, this is what it comes down to. When someone who protects their heart the most starts showing it to you, they are not losing control, they are choosing connection over protection. And that choice speaks louder than anything they could ever say. Now let's go deeper into something that on the surface looks simple, but psychologically, it's one of the clearest indicators of real emotional investment from an avoidant. When an avoidant lets you get close without immediately pulling away, you are witnessing a disruption in their default survival strategy. Because their default is distance. Not because they don't want connection, but because closeness activates something inside them that feels overwhelming. For them, intimacy isn't just emotional, it's physiological. It triggers a nervous system response that says, this is too much, regain space, regain control, step back. So under normal circumstances, the pattern is predictable. Things get good, Emotional closeness increases, and then suddenly there is a shift. They become less available, slower to respond, more focused on work, routines, or anything that restores emotional distance. It's not random, it's regulation. But when that pattern starts to break, something important is happening internally. If they stay present with you even as intimacy increases, it means the usual alarm system is not firing in the same way. And that is not because they've suddenly changed who they are. It's because in that specific connection, the cost of leaving is starting to feel greater than the discomfort of staying. That is a very specific psychological threshold. Avoidants are constantly balancing two forces, the need for connection and the fear of dependency. In most relationships, fear wins early. It's faster, more familiar, and more controllable. So they detach before they feel too much. But when they allow closeness to continue, something deeper is happening. They are beginning to associate your presence with emotional regulation instead of emotional threat. In other words, being with you doesn't destabilize them in the same way it used to. It starts to feel grounding instead of consuming. And that shift is subtle, but powerful, because for an avoidant, staying close is not passive. It's active resistance against instinct. Every moment they remain engaged instead of withdrawing is a moment where they are overriding their conditioning. They are choosing discomfort over avoidance. And people don't make that choice unless there is emotional value they cannot easily replace. This is where many people misinterpret the situation. They assume consistency means comfort, or that calm means indifference. But with avoidance, sustained closeness often means effort. It means they are managing internal tension in real time to remain present. And here's the deeper truth. They only invest that kind of internal effort when they perceive emotional safety that feels rare, not perfect, not easy, but safe enough to stay. So if you notice that they are not disappearing after moments of intimacy, if they don't immediately retreat after emotional closeness, after deep conversations, after shared vulnerability, you are seeing emotional tolerance developing where there used to be avoidance. That is not accidental. That is emotional conditioning changing. Because avoidants don't just run from people. They run from the feeling of losing themselves in people. So when they stay, it means they are beginning to trust that closeness will not erase their identity, that they can be connected without being consumed. And that is a major internal shift. It's important to understand this clearly. Staying close is not the absence of fear. It is the management of fear in favor of connection. It is the moment where avoidance stops being automatic and starts becoming a choice. And choice is where real attachment begins. So when an avoidant lets you stay close without pulling away, they're showing you that they're comfortable with the closeness and are willing to let you stay close. What you are really seeing is not just proximity, it is restraint, awareness, and emotional recalibration all happening at once. You are witnessing someone override their deepest instinct because something about the connection is worth the internal effort. And that changes everything. Because once someone learns they can stay, even when their system tells them to leave, they are no longer just avoiding intimacy, they are learning how to hold it. And that is where real transformation quietly begins. Let's take this deeper into a moment that often gets misunderstood, but psychologically reveals a great deal about emotional availability in an avoidant. When an avoidant stops escaping emotional conversations, something in their internal structure is shifting. Because for them, emotional dialogue is not just communication, is exposure. It is unpredictability. It is the risk of being pulled into something they don't fully control. So their usual strategy is to deflect, intellectualize, minimize, or simply exit the conversation altogether. Not out of disrespect, but out of self-regulation. They don't want to feel overwhelmed, so they remove themselves from the environment that creates that pressure. This is why emotional conversations are such a critical test point. When you bring up feelings, needs, concerns, or even deeper relational dynamics, you are essentially asking them to stay present in a space they are biologically and psychologically wired to leave. And most of the time, they will leave. Not because they don't care, but because their nervous system interprets emotional intensity as loss of control. But when they stay, something very important is happening beneath the surface. Staying in that conversation means they are tolerating emotional discomfort without shutting down. And that tolerance is not natural for them. It is learned in real time through trust and repeated experience with you. It means your presence has started to reframe what emotional intensity represents. Instead of danger, it begins to register as connection. And that shift is everything, because avoidants don't fear emotion itself. They fear being engulfed by it. They fear being trapped in emotional dependency, misunderstood, or overwhelmed by expectations they feel they cannot meet. So when a conversation becomes emotionally charged and they don't disengage, it means they are beginning to believe something different, that they can remain present without losing themselves. That is a profound psychological recalibration. Now, here's what makes this even more significant. Staying in emotional conversations requires effort from them that most people never see. It's not just listening, it's self-regulation in real time. They are actively managing internal tension while still trying to remain engaged with you. That means part of their attention is on the conversation, and part of it is on controlling their instinct to withdraw. So if they are doing that consistently, it is not because it's easy. It's because the relationship has crossed a threshold of importance where disengagement is no longer the preferred option. And this is where clarity matters. People often think emotional availability is about expressing feelings freely. But for an avoidant, emotional availability begins much earlier than expression. It begins with endurance, the ability to stay present when the emotional temperature rises instead of escaping into silence or distance. That endurance is the first sign of real attachment forming beneath their defenses. And over time, something subtle begins to happen. The emotional conversations that once felt threatening start to feel familiar. Not necessarily comfortable, but tolerable. And in psychology, tolerance is the bridge between avoidance and connection. It is the point where resistance stops being automatic and starts becoming negotiable. This is why these moments matter so much. Because every time they stay, instead of leaving, they are rewriting an internal rule. A rule that once said, when emotions rise, I must withdraw, slowly begins to shift into something new. I can stay and not lose myself. That is not a small change. That is identity level adaptation. So when an avoidant engages in emotional conversations without escaping, you are not just seeing better communication. You are seeing a nervous system learning a new language of safety. You are witnessing someone stay in the very space they used to avoid because your presence has become part of their emotional grounding instead of their emotional threat. And that is the real transformation. Because once someone learns they can stay in the conversation instead of disappearing from it, they are no longer just reacting to emotion. They are learning how to hold it with you. And that changes the entire future of connection. Now consider what happens when tension enters the relationship when you stop accommodating and you start expressing what isn't working for you. This is where most dynamics with an avoidant begin to fracture, because confrontation, even when calm and constructive, challenges the one thing they guard most carefully: their sense of autonomy and emotional control. For an avoidant, being called out does not register as simple feedback. It often feels like pressure, expectation, or even criticism that could pull them into emotional territory they don't feel equipped to handle. So their instinct is predictable. They withdraw, they shut down, or they create distance to regain equilibrium. Not because they dismiss your concerns, but because their system is trying to avoid escalation. That's why this next shift is so revealing. When you can express your needs, your boundaries, or your frustrations, and they don't disappear, you are seeing something fundamentally different. You are seeing a person who is choosing to stay engaged even when their internal response is telling them to leave. And that choice is not casual, because in that moment, two forces are in conflict inside them. One says, create distance, protect yourself, avoid discomfort. The other says, this connection matters, stay. When they remain present, even imperfectly, it means the second force is gaining strength. Now, that doesn't mean they suddenly respond perfectly. They may still struggle. They may go quiet, take time to process, or respond in a way that feels limited compared to what you expect. But the key variable is not perfection, it's presence. The fact that they don't cut you off, don't vanish, don't emotionally exit the relationship when things get uncomfortable, that's the signal. Because for an avoidant, staying in a moment of confrontation is an act of restraint. They are resisting the urge to disengage. They are allowing themselves to be influenced by your perspective, even if it challenges their own. And most importantly, they are tolerating the discomfort of not being in full control of the emotional environment. That's a significant shift in power dynamics because relationships at their core are built on mutual influence. But avoidants tend to operate from a position of self-containment. They prefer to regulate themselves independently rather than co-regulate through emotional exchange. So when they allow your voice to impact them, when they don't shut it out or shut you out, it means they are opening the door to shared emotional space. And shared emotional space requires trust. It requires the belief that being challenged does not equal being attacked. That being seen does not equal being controlled. That staying present will not lead to being overwhelmed or diminished. So if they remain when you speak your truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable for them, it means they are beginning to separate confrontation from threat. They are learning that conflict does not have to end the connection. And that is a foundational realization. Because once someone stops equating discomfort with danger, their capacity for intimacy expands dramatically. They no longer need to avoid every situation that challenges them. They can start engaging, adapting, and even growing within the relationship instead of stepping outside of it. But let's be clear about something this does not happen with everyone. Avoidants do not practice this level of tolerance in relationships that don't matter. If the emotional investment is low, they will simply detach. It's more efficient, more familiar, and far less demanding. So if they stay with you in those moments, if they allow the conversation to continue, if they don't cut the connection when it becomes inconvenient or uncomfortable, it means the relationship has crossed a threshold of value. You are no longer optional in the way others were. And that's where the real shift occurs. Because when someone who is wired to protect their independence starts allowing influence, feedback, and even friction without walking away, they are no longer just maintaining a connection, they are investing in it. An investment always carries risk. So when they take that risk instead of retreating, understand what you're actually seeing. You're not just seeing patience. You're not just seeing tolerance. You are seeing someone choose connection over control in a moment where control would have been easier. And that choice tells you everything you need to know. Now we arrive at something even more defining, something that sits at the very core of the avoidant psyche, control and independence. If you really want to understand an avoidant, you have to understand this independence is not just a preference for them, it is a psychological anchor. It's how they maintain stability, how they regulate emotions, and how they protect themselves from feeling overwhelmed or reliant on someone else. Their sense of control over their time, their space, and their inner world is what keeps everything balanced. So when that begins to shift, it's never random. When an avoidant starts giving up even a small degree of control or independence for you, what you're witnessing is not compromise in the ordinary sense. It's a reorganization of priorities at a deep psychological level. Because under normal circumstances, they structure their lives in a way that minimizes emotional dependency. They keep space between themselves and others. They maintain routines that don't require constant emotional engagement. They prefer autonomy because autonomy feels safe. But when you begin to matter, that structure starts to bend. Not collapse, but bend. They start making room for you in ways that are subtle at first. They adjust their schedule to see you. They include you in decisions that they would normally make alone. They allow your needs, your preferences, your presence to influence how they move through their life. And to someone on the outside, that might look small. It might even look normal. But for an avoidant, that is significant because every adjustment they make requires them to loosen their grip on control. And control for them is not just about preference, it's about safety. So when they begin to share that space with you, they are not just accommodating you, they are trusting you with parts of their structure that they usually keep guarded. This is where the deeper meaning comes in. Avoidants don't resist connection because they don't want it, they resist it because they fear losing themselves in it. They fear that closeness will come at the cost of their autonomy, that emotional investment will lead to expectations they cannot meet or dependence they cannot manage. So when they begin to integrate you into their world without pulling away to rebalance, it means they are starting to believe something new. They are starting to believe that connection does not have to equal loss of self. And that belief is transformative, because once that fear begins to dissolve, even slightly, their behavior changes in ways that are more consistent and intentional. They don't just react to the relationship, they start participating in it. They start planning, considering, adjusting, not because they have to, but because they want to maintain the connection. And that's the distinction that matters. Forced compromise creates resentment. Chosen compromise creates investment. So if they are choosing to give up some of their independence, choosing to share time, energy, and decision-making with you, it means the relationship has become something they are actively protecting, not just passively experiencing. Now, that doesn't mean they abandon their need for space. That part of them doesn't disappear. But what changes is how rigid that need is. It becomes flexible. It becomes negotiable. It becomes something they manage in balance with the relationship rather than something that overrides it. And that balance is not easy for them. It requires awareness. It requires effort. And most importantly, it requires trust that letting you in will not destabilize them, but actually add value to their sense of stability. So when you see them making space for you in their life, understand what's really happening beneath the surface. You are not just being included to or being integrated into a system that was originally designed to function without reliance on anyone else. And that integration is not something they offer lightly, because in their world, control equals safety. And when they start sharing that control, they are redefining what safety means. They are no longer finding it only in independence, they are beginning to find it in connection. And that shift, more than anything else, is what turns distance into closeness and protection into partnership. When someone who once needed complete control starts choosing shared ground, they're not losing themselves there, deciding you're worth being part of who they are. And now we come to the moment where everything becomes unmistakably clear, the point where all patterns either repeat themselves or finally break. Because up until now, everything we've talked about involves an avoidant managing closeness while still maintaining a degree of distance. They open up, but carefully. They stay, but with effort. They tolerate, but within limits. There is still a part of them that holds back, that keeps one foot outside the full weight of the connection. But this final shift is different. This is what happens when the possibility of losing you becomes real. Under normal circumstances, avoidants deal with emotional intensity by creating space. When things feel too close, too demanding, or too uncertain, they detach. And if a relationship starts to slip away, they often allow it to happen, not because they don't care, but because letting go feels safer than confronting the depth of what they feel. That's their pattern. Minimize, distance, move on, regain control. So when that pattern doesn't happen, when they don't let you walk away easily, you are no longer dealing with ordinary attachment behavior. You are witnessing a direct contradiction of their core strategy. And that contradiction only happens under one condition. The emotional value of the connection has surpassed their tolerance for loss. Think about the weight of that. For an avoidant, letting someone go is not always indifference, it's often self-preservation. It's their way of avoiding the internal chaos that comes with emotional exposure. So if they interrupt that process, if they reach out, if they try to repair, if they express something they would normally suppress, it means the cost of losing you has become greater than the cost of feeling. And that is a defining moment, because now they are no longer just managing connection, they are fighting for it. And fighting for connection is not something avoidants do lightly. It requires them to confront exactly what they've spent years avoiding: emotional dependence, uncertainty, and vulnerability at full intensity. There is no distance to hide behind in that moment. No control strategy that fully protects them. Just a clear choice: step forward or lose something that matters. When they step forward, it tells you everything. It tells you that you are not interchangeable, that this is not just comfort or familiarity. That something about this connection has moved beyond their usual thresholds and into a space where avoidance is no longer sufficient. Now, this doesn't always look dramatic. It's not always grand gestures or emotional declarations. In fact, with avoidance, it's often quieter but more meaningful. It's the message they send when they would normally stay silent, the conversation they initiate when they would usually disappear, the effort to reconnect when detachment would have been easier. These are not small actions for them. They represent internal conflict being resolved in favor of connection. And here's the deeper truth. When an avoidant tries to stop you from leaving, they are not just reacting to your absence, they are acknowledging your impact. They are recognizing in real time that your presence has become part of their emotional structure, and losing that structure creates instability they can no longer ignore. So instead of restoring balance through distance, they attempt to restore it through reconnection. That is a complete reversal of their default behavior. And that reversal is where love becomes undeniable. Because love in its most authentic form is not just about feeling, it's about what someone is willing to do when those feelings are at risk. It's about the actions they take when maintaining distance is no longer enough to protect them from loss. If an avoidant reaches for you instead of retreating, if they try to repair instead of disappear, then you can say, I'm not going to let you go. I'm going to stand my ground. If they make an effort when everything in them is wired to let go, you are not seeing confusion. You are seeing clarity breaking through fear. You are seeing someone choose emotional risk over emotional safety. And that is the moment where everything they once avoided becomes something they are finally willing to face. When someone who has mastered the art of letting go decides to hold on, you're no longer questioning what they feel, you're witnessing it. As you step back and look at all of this together, a clear pattern begins to emerge, and it's not the one most people expect. Love in an avoidant does not look like constant reassurance, effortless openness, or dramatic emotional expression. It looks like resistance being challenged. It looks like patterns being interrupted. It looks like someone quietly doing the very things they are wired not to do simply because losing you would cost them more than changing themselves. That's the thread connecting everything we've explored. When they show vulnerability, they are stepping beyond protection. When they allow closeness, they are overriding distance. When they stay in emotional conversations, they are choosing presence over escape. When they accept confrontation, they are allowing influence instead of control. When they share their independence, they are redefining safety. And when they don't let you walk away, they are finally confronting the depth of what they feel. None of these actions are accidental. None of them are easy. And none of them happen without meaning. Because for an avoidant, love is not proven by what they say when things are comfortable. It's revealed by what they do when everything in them is telling them to withdraw, detach, or disappear, and they choose not to. That's the difference. Anyone can stay when it's easy. Anyone can express affection when there's no risk. But when someone who has built their identity around emotional distance begins to lean into connection, even imperfectly, even inconsistently, it tells you that something real is happening beneath the surface. And here's the deeper truth you have to hold on to. You are not looking for perfection. You are looking for direction. Because growth in an avoidant is not measured by how quickly they change. It's measured by whether they are moving toward you or away from you when it matters most. That's the signal. That's the evidence. That's the reality. So don't get distracted by what they struggle with. Pay attention to what they choose despite that struggle. Because in the end, when someone who fears closeness starts choosing it anyway, when someone who protects their heart starts risking it with you, When someone who is comfortable letting go decides to hold on, that's not hesitation. That's love proving itself in the only way that truly matters, through action.